Other than the podcast itself, the best way to stay in touch with our various goings-on is to be on our mailing list. To sign up, go to spotlightonpodcast.com and click on Newsletter. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today, the spotlight's going to shine a little differently. Instead of a single guest, we're going to have 3 segments dealing with the importance of local music scenes. Our first guest is Shain Shapiro. Shain is a thought leader working at the intersection of music, culture, and urban policy. His book, This Must Be the Place: How Music Can Make Your City Better, came out last year on Repeater Books. Shain has defined a new way to think about the value of music and the creative economy in cities and places. He's founder and chairman of Sound Diplomacy, a global research and strategy consultancy that demonstrates the impact of the creative industries on community development and economic growth. He's also founder and executive director of the not-for-profit Global Center for Music Ecosystems. There, he collaborates with leaders and policymakers to foster policies that lead to social and economic development at the local, national, and global level. Our second segment features trumpeter and composer Thomas Marriot, who takes us through a modern history of the Seattle jazz scene with its current challenges and opportunities. We end with Seattle House Mafia, a 3-member DJ collective who tell tales of the evolution of Seattle's dance music scene. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know and support live music wherever you can. I'm very curious about the work you do. Very excited to talk with you. I wonder if you could, just to set the table for me, could you explain what an economic consultancy is in the context of the arts?
Yeah, well, an economic consultancy in the context of the arts is the same as an economic consultancy in the context of anything else. It's a little bit more challenging to demonstrate the pure economic value of arts and culture, or a particular discipline of arts and culture, and then attribute how to grow that value or how to expand that value or how to make decisions as related to whatever discipline more equitable. When it comes to arts and culture, often emotional decisions trump evidence-based decisions because people either think with their hearts rather than think with their heads. And I feel everything should be quantifiable in one way or another. It doesn't mean that it's only of economic value, but everything should be treated with an understanding of the economics around it. To me, the role of an economic consultancy in the arts is to dig deep into whatever art form and try to create data that explains the value of the art form in relation to other things, and then explains how to grow or expand or make decisions, I would say, based on kind of evidence rather than based on emotion.
Yeah. And who's typically engaging you to perform the work? Is it the municipality? Is it the developer? Like, who is there a typical use case?
Yeah, so with Sound Diplomacy, we have 3 or 4 different types of clients, I would say. First are cities themselves that, like in any sector, they have to make decisions that are representative of the local community. So they're trying to create economic data around a particular art form. That's one. The other would be the economic development community. They're usually the larger, the most active client. And that's just like any other workforce development or talent development initiative, right? It's, are we going to build something new? Or are we going to renovate something that's existing? Are we going to invest in a particular part of town? Are we going to invest in a particular sector? So the data to make those decisions. Third would be tourism. How do we grow tourism or manage tourism?
Yeah.
And then fourth would be either landowners, who have a vested interest in a particular site, like a venue or a mixed-use development or a particular part of town, or foundations, especially in the States, because obviously philanthropy and foundations can control not just capital flows, but often entire parts of town.
Yeah.
And there are some cities in the States where there are foundations that are investing heavily into districts, into particular parts of cities, and making those kind of decisions. So we work for all of those in different ways, or Sound Diplomacy works for all of those in different ways.
And it's particularly in the middle two, in the EDCs and sort of the tourism-driven inquiries, are those typically public-private partnerships at this point?
Yeah, to the most part. Again, I wish there was like, this is how it's done, because my life would be a lot easier. But
You'd know who to go pitch.
yeah, well, we have a basic understanding. We have a general understanding now. But when I started doing this, no, we didn't really have a client. So we had to create a client. So most EDCs, yes, are public-private partnerships, I would say. So whether they're a chamber of commerce or an economic development corporation or some hybrid of the two, they're usually membership organizations of companies, like a chamber kind of thing. Plus, they receive money from the public sector in one way, shape, or form, whether it be through direct investment from state government or from a levy or a tax in some way. Tourism boards tend to be funded through hotel bed tax receipts. Again, this is a generalization, but usually their objective is, how do we get more heads in beds? And music is just or other art forms is a part to play in that. So they invest in promoting or creating initiatives related to particular art forms, or to understand the heritage aspect or some sort of large scale event and how they can make something out of that. But it usually, in a general way, is about how do we increase occupancy in hotels and the ancillary spend around hotels. So restaurants, mini cabs, that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So our clients tend to come to us with a question that often doesn't have very much to do with music or culture. It's how do we retain the talent that we are educating in our university, or how do we attract a particular educated group of people to come and work here, or there's a lot of social issues too, like how do we improve this part of town, or how do we deal with some sort of community-based issue, whether it's violence or classism or racism, or whether it's systemic and actual, or all of those types of issues. And music and culture may not be the single solution to any of them, but it's part of the solution to all of them. And having an evidence base and a data framework to say, okay, well, the data is saying that we have this, that we should invest in that we don't understand that we need to talk to them more, and so on, creates a sense of structure so that decisions are made that are more equitable because they come from a place of data rather than a place of policy-based evidence making versus evidence-based policy making.
Could you tell me a little bit about, or compare and contrast for me, the work you do at Sound Diplomacy as opposed to what you're up to with the Center for Music Ecosystems?
Yeah, sure. So Sound Diplomacy is a for-profit economic consulting company, very similar to what I just described. A client comes to us with a problem and we help solve it. Like any other economic consulting company, like a KPMG or an Ernst & Young or any of them. We just tend to focus on music, culture, the arts, nighttime economy. But it's very similar, I would argue, in terms of the type of work that we do. And that's around economic impact, feasibility studies around real estate projects, policy analysis. And I stress, again, for-profit delivering work for its clients. The Center for Music Ecosystems is a nonprofit that gives everything away for the benefit of everybody. The center is a global research nonprofit that commissions research in the public good about how music can help solve problems in places. What those problems are, depending on what those places are. So we tend to think about how we can incorporate music more into bigger issues, economic growth, climate action, sustainable development, things like that. And then whatever research it commissions, it gives away. Sometimes Sound Diplomacy and the center work together. The center doesn't have economists. Sound Diplomacy has economists, but that's the core difference. And the client base is different, or donor base, I guess, when it comes to the center, because it's a 501c3. Mm-hmm. The center tends to bring in money from global organizations like the United Nations or pan-government agencies like the European Commission, United Nations, people like that. And then we will produce research that they will support, but it will involve other parties, and then it will be published for everybody to read. Where Sound Diplomacy will deliver economic analysis for a client to solve a particular issue in a particular place for that client.
Yeah.
They're meant to work together, right? That's the thing. There are some things that I can't do at Sound Diplomacy, and there's some things I can't do at the center. The whole point is to create as much data and evidence as I possibly can and satisfy clients and their objectives and their projects, but also try to create a bit of a global canon of research that I hope helps people in the future.
What is the concept, or what is the reality of a music city? What does that mean in the context of the work you do or in the constituencies you work with?
Yeah, I think it's quite a misunderstood term, and maybe I am responsible for that, or partly responsible for that. My definition is really a city that takes music seriously in a deliberate and intentional way, in all its forms and functions. So it doesn't matter on the size of the city. It doesn't matter on its branding and its naming or anything. It's really about data, evidence, and policy. So a city that collects data to understand where everything is, how it fits together, how much it's worth, what the deficiencies are, how music relates to other things like workforce development, tourism, community development, and then makes decisions based on that data. So music cities not often, I would say some music cities are focused more on the branding side or the tourism side. Some are more focused on workforce development. In its core, for me, it's about treating music as seriously as you would treat anything else. It's not making music special. It's not elevating it in any way. It's about creating an evidence-based structure to make better decisions about the city that then impact music. So for me, I'm always thinking how music can be like a nail in search of many hammers rather than a hammer in search of many nails. And the way that I think about music is how it can be inserted into solving bigger problems by really focusing on the external value of music as much as we would focus on the internal value of music. So expanding, growing, investing in one's music industry is part of it, but it's not the sole means to an end of making policies related to music cities. Mm-hmm. My hope is that over time, we see healthcare systems incorporate music more. We see education systems incorporate music more, but not just to have more music education, to have better total education. The evolution of music in cities and places, I hope, will evolve into that. But every place takes it in their own way. And often we focus on things that we can see. So there's a lot of focus on live music and festivals because you can see them. Can't see intellectual property, Yeah. So it's one of those things that I think is just beginning to take hold and I hope will continue to expand.
Something else that comes up is this notion of music in place, right? And I talk to a lot of artists who bring a perspective about place, either where they're from and the music that informed them, or even more frequent, where they go to because they want to seek inspiration or they want to record in a certain environment or they want to collaborate because they hear a sound in an area that is important to them. The notion of music in place as it relates to your work can be both very specific and indigenous. You talked about like a music city could highlight its organic sort of historical musical roots, or it could also be, for lack of a better way to say it, manufactured. Like we're going to make the broader notion of music important to our economic development or to our cultural life because it attracts businesses and keeps our best and brightest here. And I wonder, as you pursue a new project, are you looking for the essence? Are you like, how important is, I don't want to say the authenticity because I think that's a tricky word and it's a judgmental word.
Very tricky word.
A policy-driven decision isn't necessarily inauthentic. It could be actually very authentic when it can be existential. But I wonder how you think about, like on the Venn diagram of policy, business, and culture, what's your way in when you think about a project?
It's always policy, I'll be honest. So we don't get involved in any questions around the perception and reality of how people view their own community. Everyone's version of their own music city is their own. And this is when we start to get into trouble, is when, again, decisions get made based on someone's personal experience, however valid, is not another person's personal experience. I can't think of another word, right? But the authenticity, I guess, in the most general sense of the word, of a place is in the eye of the beholder. And everyone has their own version of it. I really treat music apolitically or agnostically in this context. I just go in and every genre, every discipline, doesn't matter to me. Mm-hmm. Music is music. I tell clients, or we tell clients, when we say the word music, it's whatever you want it to mean. And whatever you want it to mean is valid, but it's not the only definition of music. We live in a world where certain genres are prioritized, other genres are criminalized. We have a a lack of understanding of the breadth of musical experience. Everything from like drumcore to gore metal and everything in between, right? We try to be very careful to not get involved in that. But also at the same time, it's very important for it to be very kind of analytical and very agnostic in that sense. So the data speaks to everybody as much as possible. Because I don't want to devalue someone's personal experience of a place or vision or version of how they feel about music in their place, because however they feel is completely valid. We're kind of going above that. And I don't mean that hierarchically. I just mean like above to hopefully produce data that speaks to everybody. But I don't tend to get involved like Nashville versus a city like Nashville, which has historical attributions to music, or a city like Huntsville down the road, which doesn't as much, are the same to us. Like a city is a city is a city, a place is a place is a place.
Yeah.
It's all about the data, not about the feeling.
Huntsville's fascinating to me, partially because I have friends and professional friends that were part of that development with the amphitheater. But I'm also intrigued with Huntsville as sort of representative of like what a modern American, for lack of a better way to say it, like secondary or tertiary market could look like. Like it was fascinating to me to learn about the role of your firm's work there. It makes total sense in hindsight that it would be much more programmatic and much more policy driven and policy necessitated to take that canvas and to put something on it. And I wonder, are these other cities revitalizing? Is that a thing? Is there a move to these secondary and tertiary market cities where there's a return to vibrance there?
I think so. It's hard for me to speak. Like, I think general trends are we're all looking for cheaper places to live.
Yeah.
That's one. Places like a Huntsville or a Tulsa or an Indianapolis, Cincinnati, or these types of cities in the US, which are not that difficult to get to or close to big cities, may not be New York, Chicago, LA, Austin, whatever. But I do believe that those kind of mid-sized cities are competing more post-COVID for creative workers than they were before COVID. I don't have a huge amount of data to back that up off the top of my head. I just see it that you can have a cultural and creative career in those places or have a better chance of it, probably compared to 5 or 10 years ago, just because there is often more infrastructure. Obviously, it's depending on what you do, but it's relatively easy to communicate with people.
Yeah.
And if you live in the middle of the country too, at least you're not that far from anywhere, compared to if you live on one side, you're at least far from the other side. Yes, and that's definitely one of the arguments from these cities, EDCs and talent attraction professionals. Like Huntsville's an hour and 20 minutes from Nashville and about an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes from Atlanta. You can say, if we can offer you our version of a high quality of life with a cultural offer that keeps you entertained, then I'm sure that people would see it as good as a place to live as Nashville or Atlanta. And then you're looking at maybe it's for every dollar you're spending in Nashville, maybe you're spending 90 cents in Huntsville. That was one of the arguments to build the Orion at the beginning was if you're going to attract the best and the brightest to Huntsville, you need a facility that can attract the best and the brightest to come and play there.
In the work specifically with sound diplomacy, is it all inbound or are you identifying markets or regions that you feel are ripe for, I don't know if redevelopment's the right word, but this sort of music and culture tip of the spear work that you do?
Yeah, obviously from a business development point of view, we're constantly kind of surveying and exploring where we think our work would be most impactful and who would be most interested in chatting with us. We've been doing it for a long time all over the world. So you kind of learn over time where certain things are, where certain trends are occurring. And that could be political, that could be economic. But in terms of like predicting, no, not really. I liken it, and I'm now the board chair of sound diplomacy, so I'm not as involved in the day-to-day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, there's an amazing team running the show. My belief is it doesn't matter if you're the fastest car in the race if there's no racetrack. So focus on building the best possible racetrack that you can, and then the cars will come. And that's where my mentality has always been, is it's not about us, it's about the work, but even not about us doing the work, it's about the work happening. The more places that are engaged and want to do the work, some will gravitate towards us. Mm-hmm. But if there are no places that want to do it, right? So most of the focus over the last 10 years has been about building the racetrack. And we've seen new cars have come, like there's people doing this that aren't us. There's lots and lots of communities doing it on their own, in their own way, good and bad, to be honest. But we're seeing now that the focus on building the racetrack has given us quite a bit of understanding as to, okay, what cars should we target?
Yeah. Is there an economic development flywheel in that after you work or after your initial work with a community, what are the markers that you would look at over time to say, you know what, the impact was made or the impact is being made now and it's starting to achieve the objective?
It's similar to any other economic analysis, to be frank. There's some stuff that you really struggle to quantify, which is, are people happier? Are they going out more? You can quantify that. Are they enjoying the music or cultural scene in the community more? Is it bringing people together? It's kind of hard to understand, especially from afar. But you can quantify the amount of jobs, you can quantify the economic uplift, you can quantify the multiplier effect, the indirect economic benefit that music, culture, whatever would have on the community. You can count new pieces of infrastructure or investments that are made. So we do all of that. In every community, we are keeping a record of what's happening.
Gotcha. Shain, thank you for your work and thank you for your time today.
No, well, thanks, Lawrence. I hugely appreciate it. And yeah, it's a real pleasure. Thank you.
Up next is trumpeter, composer, and producer Thomas Marriot, a force for jazz on the West Coast. Thomas has worked with artists as diverse as Maynard Ferguson, Charlie Hunter, Ivan Neville, and hip-hop pioneer Deltron 3030. A leader on 14 of his own albums, Thomas is the youngest inductee into the Seattle Jazz Hall of Fame and is founder of Seattle Jazz Fellowship, a nonprofit arts organization dedicated to promoting jazz music and jazz culture in Seattle. I wondered if I don't want to spend a ton of time in the Wayback Machine in the distant past, but I wonder if as a way to level set, you could tell me a little bit about the Seattle you grew up in and what was going on then culturally, what you had access to. Just sort of paint a picture for me, that the city's changed so much, the options that are available to visitors and citizens has changed. And I'm just curious, what was your Seattle early on in life?
Early on in life, when I was a teenager, I had the opportunity I could just take the bus down to Pioneer Square and hear some of the masters at work, some of the old timers playing, and they were really accessible to anybody who could show up. There was no cover charge. Nobody hassled us. It was safe. Yeah, there was always that element in the street, but at the same time, the people in the nightclub would sort of keep an eye on me and my brother when we would go down to the New Orleans as teenagers and check it out. A little later on, I moved out of my folks' house when I was 18 and my rent was $275 a month. And I could make that much gigging on the weekend. And I could park my car right in front of the club or take the bus without feeling like it was dangerous or anything like that. Not that it's dangerous now, but it's a little different vibe than it was. Seattle was a lot more laid back, a lot more blue collar, a lot less affluent. And I think that the change in the city has really affected the city culturally. But I know that there just was a lot of people at work. There was just a lot more gigs that paid money, cheap rent. It was easy to be an artist and kind of do your own thing here. I think that's one of the things that's changed.
Something else, I read an interview with you as part of preparing for our time together, and you were talking about the role of jazz education, how you can have jazz music and you can be a musician without the formal education part, but you can't have jazz education without the music, like without living it and breathing it and sort of doing it. It's really interesting to be able to pursue that with you. I'm curious, could you unpack just a little bit about what your musical training was? And as a corollary to that, what were you going to school for? Like, was there an alternate universe for Thomas Marriot at one point?
No. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, the music sort of found me at a pretty young age, before I even picked up a trumpet, to be honest. And so I've been on this path for a really long time, and that has brought its own benefits and complications. There are assets and liabilities that are attached to that. But as far as my own education, My grandparents were both professional musicians and music teachers. So my first education on my instrument was from my grandfather and my father, who also played. So I learned a lot about music and about how to play the instrument from them. And starting at a very young age, my grandfather would be like, come upstairs and put your mouth on the tuba, and make a noise, or play the trombone, or here's a saxophone, and try this violin. There was sort of a musical petting zoo that I grew up in. And my dad was a huge avid record collector, and his jazz record collection was off limits to my brother and I. So of course, that's what we did, is we messed with dad's records. And I think at first we were just really captivated by the names: Monk, Dizzy, Bird, Nuke, Hawk, Prez. And we just thought it was funny. Salt Peanuts by Dizzy Gillespie. We just play that over and over again, just crack up. But that break that he would play on Salt Peanuts always blew my mind. And so I wanted to learn how to do that. Started taking it very seriously in junior high school. I went to a junior high school, didn't really have much of a music or jazz program, but was turned on by the music, started going to hear live jazz, going to hear Floyd Stanford every Wednesday. I became a regular at the New Orleans in Pioneer Square at the age of about 14. Went to Garfield High School, played in the band, got to go to Europe, play at the big jazz festivals, meet Quincy Jones, got to meet Miles Davis, George Clinton, a lot of famous musicians, and really was like, this is for me. I was gigging starting in high school, played my first paid professional gig my sophomore year of high school, subbing for Jay Thomas, who's a local jazz hero around here. A few months after that, I got a regular gig at a place called the Speakeasy every other Friday with some older musicians, a little older musicians, like they were in their mid-20s, and I was about 16 or 17. And we started playing there. It was in Belltown, and it was an all-ages spot that had a piano. And so we were there 5 or 6 years. I really learned how to play on that gig, learn tunes, tried to work with others, and also Tula's was right down the block, so I would always be going over there to check it out, what was happening there. There was a lot of cross-pollinization, on the block at that time. But my folks were definitely of the mind of like, no, you're going to college. So I was recruited to go to UW by Roy Cummings, who at that time was the head of the program. And so I went to UW to study jazz studies. And it was kind of an interesting experience because a lot of the students in my high school were much, much more accomplished jazz performers than the majors at the UW. And the big band, frankly, was just a lot more swinging in my high school than it was at the college. So I started looking for opportunities to go on the road starting in college. I think part of the thing about staying in Seattle at that time for me was that I was busy working. Going to a conservatory, I just didn't really have the money to go to Juilliard or anything like that. And I don't know that I had the grades for it either necessarily. But I was working. I was getting a real bandstand education. I was plugged in. I knew all the cats. They knew me. I was getting called. I was busy. I started working at the Seattle Repertory Jazz Orchestra on the trumpet section, sitting next to Floyd and Jay and Ed Lee. And that was really an education. I think going to the jazz club every single week, that was a real education. But then I went on the road with Maynard Ferguson and did that for about a year and a half. And when I got off, I moved to New York. In there, I did the Carmine Caruso trumpet competition and other things. And then in New York, things kind of took off from there. So, I have a good balance, I feel like, of the academic learning and the traditional way of learning.
Yeah.
It's impossible to have a career, and it's impossible to get better without the benefit of community. You can't do this by yourself. It's not music that exists in a vacuum. It exists in a community. The community here in Seattle has changed over time. It's changed everywhere over time. That's what communities do. But the jazz community in particular is noticeably different now than it was 20 or 30 years ago in a way that I think has been detrimental to the music. So if you hear me talking about community, it's because community is the vehicle by which we will uplift jazz music. And that's true everywhere. Community is always the vehicle that uplifts jazz music. And every community is local in the music. I've had the benefit for the last 15 or 20 years of engaging and playing with musicians in other local communities. I'm a local musician. I'm not playing at the Blue Note in the Village Vanguard and stuff like that. I play at Smalls when I go to New York, which is a community spot. When I go to Philly, I play at Chris's. It's a community spot. It's not the big names. Don't play there. I don't have that kind of career. So I engage and rely on the help of local communities, many of which are much stronger than ours. And I just think about, what do they have that we don't? And what did we have that we don't anymore? that still exists in other places. And there's some just basic deficiencies in our community in Seattle that still persist in other places. And that's why they have more healthy and vibrant jazz communities at the local level. Like I said, every jazz community is local, even in New York City. There are lots of amazing, incredible players nobody outside of New York really knows about because they're local musicians. They play all the time in New York. They don't really have any reason or need to come out here.
One of the other things that came up in reading other discussions with you was you talked about that Seattle doesn't necessarily have a thriving jazz community, though it has some of the seeds of it, and that the work with the Jazz Fellowship and that other people are doing is hopefully going to get us there, in air quotes for listeners. I'm curious, what are the hallmarks of a jazz community? And if that's too broad of an answer because it has to change, like what would be the hallmarks in Seattle where you'd say we made progress?
The way that I look at it is, what are the hallmarks of a healthy jazz community? Because that's what we want.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hallmarks of shitty jazz communities. We could talk about that. But as far as like, what are the hallmarks of a healthy, vibrant jazz community? Not a tough question at all. There's a few key elements, and these are sort of the things that we're trying to achieve with the Jazz Fellowship. The main one is there's a venue, a dedicated space for jazz. We don't have that, but all these other communities do. So I think having a venue that's a dedicated space for local jazz is probably the primary hallmark of a thriving jazz community. Where we used to have many operating concurrently, we now have none. That's a huge problem. Another part of it is elders and mentorship. We don't really have that either. And a lot of the elders in our community, the Buddy Catletts, the Hadley Calamans, the Floyd Standifers, they passed on. And I think they took their responsibility as elders in the music a little more seriously than the people who are now the elders, who were middle-aged when I was coming up and now are older. They're still trying to get theirs. And I think that they maybe never felt like they arrived, and that they're not really necessarily in a place to be telling anybody anything, but they are. And I think it actually is their job to keep everybody else in line musically. When you have young musicians that play too much, it's really helpful to have one of the older musicians say, stop doing that. Don't do it that way. Or when you do something that they like, to give them your approval. That's the way to do it. We don't really have that so much. Part of it is that everybody's, I think in Seattle, is kind of a little sensitive maybe about feedback, but also this is a place where everybody wants to do their own thing. They don't want to hear from anybody else about how to do stuff. So I think mentorship and having some elders, but also having a younger generation of musicians that is open to and seeking the knowledge of elders, I think is also something that we don't really have so much in this community. So a dedicated space, mentorship, and I'd say one of the other hallmarks is gigs that pay money. And it seems obvious, but in a lot of other places, musicians can actually make a living playing music. Jazz musicians can make a living playing jazz. Impossible in Seattle. You could have every single jazz gig in town and work 5 nights a week and make less than $30,000 a year. You're not going to live in Seattle on that. So teaching, playing other kinds of music, working a day job, those are all necessary requirements in Seattle. There are no full-time performers. And that's a real problem as well. So how do we incentivize that? How do we incentivize excellence? What is the impetus for any musician to write that big piece of music, to rehearse that band, to get it together and make it really sound excellent? Why? So you can go debut it somewhere and pay everybody $20? That's an awful lot of work to get nothing out of it. So you might do it once and then that's the end of it. You're probably not going to go to that effort again. So there's no brass ring to strive for. There's nothing to grab. There's a ceiling that people hit pretty much right away in their careers here. We have a lot of mediocrity here. And a lot of the mediocrity is really held up as an example of what we should all be doing. And I think part of that comes from a desire to be inclusive. And I appreciate that. But I also feel like some of the musicians have abdicated their responsibility over the music. In other words, where's the accountability if you get up on the bandstand and sound bad?
Yeah.
There is none. That's not true in other places. If you get up on the bandstand and sound bad, they're going to tell you, that still exists in a lot of places. It doesn't really exist here.
What are the conversations like then that you're able to have? And just to be a little bit more specific, that's some true talk right there. And I wonder, are you able to have these discussions, and are these like widely agreed upon concerns and views? Or is Thomas Marriot out in the wilderness ranting and raving about these things and no one's listening? Like, are your peers and colleagues saying, you know what, this is a call to arms. These are real issues. What do we do? It's fascinating. It's such a straight articulation of needs, which could ultimately lead to prescriptions and next steps. How do your peers and colleagues receive this?
I think that in general, they agree. I think we all know that the bar for jazz music in Seattle is kind of low. But I think in the mean, it's not that good. But why would it be good? There's no place to play. You only get better by playing on the bandstand. And if there's no bandstands to play on, who's ever going to get better? How do the people who are at the top stay sharp? How do people at the bottom work their way up?
Yeah.
There is no mechanism for that. And so when I talk about those things, I think that the people in the community very much recognize those things. I don't know how many people in the community are actually listening to me when I say that, but I know that the ones that do agree with me. I think it's kind of a small group of folks that are interested. And this is true in every community. It's mostly made up of people who are kind of jazz dabblers, who play a little jazz, teach jazz, but they're not really trying to be expert performers. It's not really in their larger scheme. You know what I mean? They're content to play a little bit here and a little bit there. And that's cool. I mean, to each their own. Not everybody has to be striving to be the best. That's okay. But for those that are, there are scant resources for you in Seattle. And I believe I know what the prescription is, and I believe I know how we can get out of it. But it does take participation from everybody. And I'm not sure that Seattle is a place where everybody's really interested in participating.
It's interesting because I have versions of this conversation with people in other cities, maybe related to jazz, maybe not, certainly related to the arts more generally, and to widen the concentric circles to all kinds of causes and what I would broadly call like public affairs types issues. And it seems particularly difficult on the West Coast. I talk to people who are involved in launching nonprofits, doing community organizing in the arts and music. And the tension seems to be there's more money sloshing around these cities than ever before, but there seems to be a real generational difference between the money that is made and earned and wealth that's created now versus some idyllic good old days when there was more of a sense of community stewardship, investment in the local community. I mean, just to be very pointed and direct about it, a lot of the sort of the finance and tech money is being accumulated and amassed as opposed to invested in communities. And when it is invested, it's invested in things like, how do we go to Pluto? Not how do we get our children to be responsible, creative citizens? Is that in the mix for you? Am I putting words in your mouth?
You're not putting words in my mouth at all. I would definitely say that as Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, all of those cities have become more affluent, it means that the rent has gone up. And when the rent goes up, musicians got to leave. That's just historically true everywhere. And you're right. The way that the cities have become affluent, I think, is maybe what you're putting your finger on. In Seattle, and I think this is true, like you said, on the West Coast, the tech money, it has led to more affluence, but it has not necessarily led to more culture. And in fact, it has had a stifling effect on culture. And when they do spend money, when I see philanthropy towards music, what I see is jazz education being funded at every level in Seattle. I can't speak to other places, but we have jazz education being funded for elementary school, junior high school, college, and for the adult beginner, the adult amateur. And when I say at the high level, I mean millions and millions and millions of dollars. But there is no money for jazz music. There is for jazz education. And we have sort of two parallel industries, the jazz education industry and jazz music, which is not much of an industry anymore. I think jazz education is an obvious way for philanthropists in our community to say, I'm doing something to help the arts. I'm doing something to help jazz music, which maybe they are a fan of, or maybe they see it as a worthy cause, and that's cool. But I mean, if we wanted to fund classical music in Seattle, we fund the symphony. We don't fund classical music education. Maybe we do, but we also fund the symphony and the ballet and the opera. Where is that infrastructure for jazz music? Not to mention that, for the most part, those are European art forms. Jazz is an American art form. Where is the money for jazz music, specifically local jazz music? And I would say that there isn't any.
Yeah.
Well, there is now. I'm not going to lie. Our fundraising at Seattle Jazz Fellowship has been pretty good. So there is money for jazz music, but we're just turning on the tap.
It's really interesting. So many different things come up for me here, hearing some of those comments. I think of going to New York from Connecticut as a younger person and going to museums and galleries and openings and jazz shows and experiencing art up and down the levels. It was entertainment, but it was fun and interesting and stimulating.
Mm-hmm.
But just to be frank, it was also, as careers and lives developed, it was a signifier in a way that I don't see that necessarily on the West Coast. I don't see people excited about, like, I want to develop an aesthetic. It's like, I don't know.
No, I know. I'll tell you, it's gotten more affluent, but it's just gotten bougier, because instead of saying, hey, let's go check out some of that jazz. It's like, I'm going to spend my $500 and go see Pearl Jam. I'm going to spend my $1,000 to see Taylor Swift. And that's cool. And you get bragging rights for, like, hey, I got a ticket to the big show and I spent the money. And I think it's more about spending the money than it is about the musical experience for a lot of people. When I play at Smalls in New York, people just go out. I mean, I lived in New York for a number of years, and people just go out to hear jazz just on account of because. They go see weird cinema just on account of because it's so readily available. They go to the museum because something to do. And of course, nobody wants to spend any time in their tiny little hot apartment.
Yeah.
So you get out. People go out more. And I think here we get really comfortable inside our pads, all the comforts of home, never have to leave. In fact, you don't even have to go to the club. You can stream their show and pretend that you've supported those artists. Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Just because there's money does not necessarily always mean there's going to be well-supported arts because there's money. Look at SF Jazz. They built this incredible institution to the music in San Francisco, and it's even named after that city, SF Jazz. Think of any San Francisco-based jazz musicians that have headlined in their big room in the last time that they've been open.
Incredible.
Very, very few, if any.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
How can that be?
I think about that a lot. I think about that venue. Yeah.
So SF Jazz has nothing to do with SF, you know what I'm saying? Except for that's where it exists.
Yep.
And for the folks that have donated to that institution, they don't care. They have their name on the little thing when you walk in the door. That's what they care about. I helped build this. And that's great for them. And I appreciate what they're doing. And we need institutions like that. But it can't be the only thing that we have, because that's saying that the only people allowed to make a living are the people at the very, very, very top, the 1% of jazz artists who make it to that level in their career, which is a really small number of people. And I don't begrudge them their living. They got to play too. But so do the vast majority of us. So if you're me or any other sort of local regional jazz musician, you want a gig in San Francisco, you're going on tour, you're never going to make ends meet. You could play the Black Hat and they might pay you $800 or $1,000 for your band. It's not going to go very far. It's local pay everywhere. And the way we think about funding the arts has to be, to me, more local. If we're going to really have a scene, if we're really going to have a community, if the arts really matter. Look at PNB. They have a whole school dedicated to dance, in addition to their season of professional dance that they do.
Yeah.
That's great. That's wonderful. We could use something like that. We have jazz education, but let's face it, most of those institutions don't crank out professional musicians. That's not their point. For the vast majority of people, it's something to do to get together with people and hang out. That's great. That's the whole purpose of music. But the idea that this is going to churn out the next generation of jazz artists, I don't think so. But look at all the jazz education there is in Seattle. How many professional musicians have it turned out that have been able to maintain a career longer than 5 or 10 years?
Yeah.
Not that many.
Well, and to your point, without the other pieces, even if we were churning out jazz musicians, we'd be bleeding them away to other places with more opportunities.
And we are. All those really gifted kids from those big programs, they don't stick around here.
Yeah.
The ones that we want to stay, they move away because the perception is that there's nothing here for them, that if they're going to increase their learning and their opportunities, they have to move away. That wasn't true when I came up here. There were plenty of opportunities to learn and grow and pay dues and do all of those things. I still think that there are. You have to really seek it out.
Yeah.
Moving away, obviously, is an easy thing to do.
So you've taken action, essentially, in various evolving forms over the last several years.
Mhm.
You've articulated some of the hallmarks of a scene. You've articulated some of the problem statements. What are you doing? How are you doing it? And how's it going?
What are we doing? So in 2020, I started thinking about what are we coming back to? Our scene was kind of in shambles, and it looked like there was not going to be a dedicated space for jazz moving forward. There was going to be some clubs that had some jazz some of the time, but no place that's going to pay anybody a professional wage. So I started Seattle Jazz Fellowship. Started thinking about it in 2020, wrote our mission statement and what we were about, and gathered some board members and formally incorporated in 2021 in January. Later that year in October, we started producing shows, and we started with a series. And the point of the series was to just get people into the idea of, let's just hang out, bring the music back in person. Let's give the musicians an opportunity to play where they can actually make a buck. So the mission of Seattle Jazz Fellowship is to build community. That's the first tenet of our mission. The second one is to increase mentorship, or to provide access to the mentorship cycle is probably a better way of saying it. To incentivize excellence and to lower barriers to access jazz for musicians and for listeners alike. So if you are a teenager who loves jazz, where do you go hear it? In the wild. Where do you go hear the real thing? I had lots of opportunities to do that. They don't really exist now unless you go to Jazz Alley and you got to drop $120. So that's not accessible for the most part to most people. So we have to make excellent jazz available to the public and also to younger musicians and for anybody else who wants to hear it. So if jazz at the high level only exists for people that are wealthy, well, of course, we're never going to have more jazz music here. It's just a kind of a no-brainer. The way that Seattle Jazz Fellowship works is we have 3 fundraising streams. They are grants, corporate sponsorships, and membership, as well as private donations. So I guess that's 4. If you purchase an annual membership, you get to come into all of our events for free. Your name is on the list. You just say your name to the door person, they check you off, and you come in. And if you don't have a membership, it's a $20 suggested donation. If you got $20, great. If you have $1, that's fine too. If you have nothing, that's fine too. So we're not giving it away, but we are making it by suggested donation. And we're offering the musicians and the artists an opportunity to do their best work in front of a meaningful audience for meaningful pay. Mm-hmm. For the audience, we're providing a regular place to find the music, and it doesn't really matter who's playing. It's always going to be good. And so what we find is that people come back over and over and over again because it's not about this artist or that artist. It's about the music. And I think that's something that's kind of got lost. A lot of musicians these days are very careerist. It's me all the time. And that's cool. That's promotion. And that's how the game is played. But we have to be careful. Are we using jazz to aggrandize ourselves? Or are we aggrandizing the music through our work? And I see a lot of organizations and institutions in Seattle that use the jazz term or the jazz label or the jazz name to really further other agendas that don't really have anything to do with the music. We really just are focused on the music, making it a place where people can come and listen and musicians can come and play. So we ran the series seasonally in 2021 and 2022. So 6 weeks in the summer, 6 weeks in the winter, 6 weeks in the fall, and paid out about $100,000 to musicians in the community, raised about that much money.
Wow.
And in January of 2024, we moved into our own location. So we were previously doing these shows at an art gallery on Capitol Hill called Vermilion, which was great for us to build our membership base and get people used to the idea of coming to hear the music. Now we have our own venue. It's a pop-up. We have a rent-free lease. I have a 1-year rent-free lease, pay the utility. There's not a lot we're allowed to do in this space except for what we do. But I have a key and can come and go as I please, and I can do whatever I want in there. So we have our piano, our drum set, our PA, and 50 chairs, and a little bar that sells beer and wine. And we have live jazz Thursday, Friday, Saturday. We host listening sessions with Julian Priester. We have all ages jam sessions on the weekend. And we're looking at expanding our programming because right now we're raised about $500,000 for our Seattle Jazz Fellowship. And I would say 80% of that goes right into the pockets of musicians. So we're paying musicians well. We do a lot of double bills where we have a musician who's younger paired with a musician who's older, or somebody who's more traditional paired with somebody who's more experimental, mainly so they can be in the same room together. When I came up, I knew all the musicians in town, regardless of what stripe of jazz they played, Now, when I talk to some of the younger musicians, they don't even know who is Phil Sparks, who is Bill Anshel. And these guys have been around here a long time. They don't even know them. So how do we get them to know them? Since musicians don't hang as much in Seattle like they do in other communities, that building community part is really big for us. So we double bill a lot of our gigs so that we have that fellowship actually happening. It's a shame that we have to kind of engineer that, to be honest. We tell people who want a booking, don't email us, don't call me, come in. I keep the calendar behind the bar at the venue. If you want a gig, you actually have to show up. The problem is, if we don't start supporting our own art form, if we don't support each other as musicians, we're never going to get anywhere as a community. Mm-hmm. The way we incentivize that is by, again, these double bills, but also we tell musicians if they want a gig, you got to come in. You got to make it to somebody else's show. You got to hear somebody else. You got to be willing to buy what you are selling. Seems, again, like common sense, but again, we don't have that here. And there are a lot of reasons why. Like I had one musician that I really wanted to book. I was like, man, I'd love to book you, but you got to come in. And he's, I can't come in because I have to teach. I need the money. I can't really afford to take that 2 hours off. And to me, I'm like, that's the price you got to pay is for being an artist, to give up that teaching income once so that you can have a gig that pays a real paycheck. That's what it takes. Otherwise, we're always going to be a community of teachers first and musicians second and artists third. It starts with us. It really starts with us. So what are we doing about it? How do we build community? We build community by showing up, but there has to be something for people to show up to. And when there's a little jazz here and a little jazz there, it's very hard for people to know when and where to show up. And I think we have full houses, but I would love to see more cats in the house. It would really make a huge difference because it's our clubhouse. And I think a lot of people are just not interested in that, or not able to, just for financial reasons. It's cyclical.
How do you feel in general about the Pioneer Square neighborhood? Is that where you'd want to be given its history and context, or are you neutral? You just want space? Like, I'm really curious about that location.
Yeah. So it's definitely a conscious decision. It's where we want to be, and for a lot of reasons. One of the things we always talk about is, why is the jazz community in Seattle so white?
Yeah.
Part of it is it's Seattle. Seattle's a very white city, but also a lot of the music happens in the North End, which is the white part of town. So to us, if we are, again, part of our mission is to make the music accessible, well, we need to bring it to where the people are. And Pioneer Square is a place that's extremely accessible by light rail. It's very centrally located. It doesn't really feel like any person or any group's territory. It's kind of a neutral area for everybody. It's also very much the historical jazz district of Seattle, and may even be going that way again with Alan Thistle, Underbelly, Fred Holmes Gallery, Seattle Jazz Fellowship.
Yeah.
That's all regular weekly presentations of jazz within a 3-block radius. And there's only more coming. To me, we have the opportunity to really create the jazz district again in Pioneer Square.
Yeah.
Also, you're looking for empty storefronts, and there's a whole lot of them in Pioneer Square.
Yeah, there's that. Yeah. You know, the last couple of art walks I went to down there, it felt really good. Like I was like, wow, there's some vibe. Like there's some funky stuff going on. It's not uptight art galleries that are like precious and inaccessible. Like it was fun. It was a vibe on the street. There were people.
A lot of young people.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they've worked really hard at that. It's been many decades that Art Walk has been going, and they offer free parking and all of that, and it's a vibe. It's a big party.
Yeah, it's exciting. The most unfair question: are you an optimist? Are you optimistic?
About what?
I mean,
I'm gonna be honest, man. I mean, we're in a public forum, and I feel obligated to say yes, I'm optimistic. It depends on what day you ask me. I'll be really honest.
That's fair.
Sometimes I feel really optimistic. When the house is full and there's a lot of cats and the music sounds great and there's like money in the bank, I feel optimistic.
Yeah.
When the audience is empty and the music's not very good, I don't feel so optimistic. It's sometimes hard to see the forest through the trees, you know? So I'm probably not the best person to ask, but I feel, to be honest, starting Seattle Jazz Fellowship, I thought we'd run it for a couple, 3-4 years, kind of get the ball rolling again, and then that'd be it. I didn't really think that we would sort of be the stewards of the community. I didn't really want us to.
No, you're building an institution. Let's be clear.
Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, the fundraising has been quite robust. So I keep waiting for it to run out of money so I can step away from it. But it doesn't really seem like it's going to run out of money anytime soon. So there's a lot of optimism with that. What we're looking at doing the Fellowship Festival in February, 3 or 4 day festival with a bunch of different events. Yeah, we're doing what we do. I'm just going to keep doing it till the money does run out, kind of like playing the trumpet. That's the old joke. Jazz musicians, I'm just going to keep doing it till the money runs out. I guess that's true with Seattle Jazz Fellowship. At some point, I will step away and somebody else will take it over. While I'm committed to it, I do look forward to that day because so many jazz institutions suffer from the person at the top being there too long, and they outlive their usefulness to the organization. And if it's really a sustainable organization, can it thrive without them? I definitely want Seattle Jazz Fellowship to continue without me. I'm a musician first and foremost. It definitely does cut into my ability to be an artist. That being said, it's not like my phone is ringing off the hook. There just aren't that many gigs in Seattle. So it hasn't been that much of a challenge to juggle both things. But as we grow, as I get busier, there's going to be more conflicts and more staff's going to be required. We have the money to do all that though. So yeah, I'm optimistic. And also, I'll be honest, I've now heard pretty much every local musician play. I hosted the jam session at the Royal Room for 3 years and have been hosting this series, and now every music, and I'm at every show. A few hundred jazz events that we've done with the fellowship and also hosting the jam session. And
yeah,
I'm not super optimistic about the level of musicianship, to be honest, for jazz. There's some incredible musicians working in Seattle, really incredible musicians working in Seattle. But as far as the jazz community, it's still kind of small. In Seattle, we've expanded the definition of the music to include more people and more music for survival. We've had to. What flies as jazz music in Seattle would not fly in other cities because they have more robust jazz communities, which only puts up with certain things, I guess. We're fighting against the forces of academia. I don't mean to say it nefariously, but what academia teaches sometimes in the community, we have to unteach to really make it authentic. And I guess what I mean is, again, this notion that I just play with my friends and that's sufficient. I'm out of school, so I'm just launching a career with my own band. And the idea of learning to play with a lot of other people and make them sound good or learn their music or whatever and be versatile and still be yourself, those skills are just not really taught. Jazz education can teach us about the notes, but the music is not the notes. It's the community, but it's also the feeling. Why do we play jazz music? We don't do it for the money. Doesn't mean we don't want to make a living, but why do we do it? Well, we do it for the spiritual rewards. Fellowship being one of those spiritual rewards, that feeling of togetherness, the ungendered feeling of brotherhood or sisterhood. It's probably one of the highest spiritual rewards we receive as being musicians. If there are no spiritual rewards and there's no money, then why are we going to do it? Maybe a more metaphysical level, Seattle Jazz Fellowship is really more interested in making sure that those spiritual rewards are still present and still exist. I don't know any classrooms where they teach that. I've only learned that on the bandstand from other musicians. In that sense, I see a lot of musicians, super accomplished, coming out of school, writing a lot of hard music, but the way they present the music, it's like a classroom. It's like they're giving a recital, lots of pages and pages of music that they didn't really learn that well. So they're really reading it hard, glued to the music stand. They're going to tell you all about the music before they play it, so you don't get to make up your own mind about it or discover something of your own in it. So the way that the music is presented stems from academia as well. And I think that in and of itself is a deterrent to a lot of people. Pretty much most people, when they think about live music, it's not an experience where there's music stands involved unless they're going to the orchestra. And I think for jazz, we've come into this thing where the more music you can write and the more notes you can put on the page, the better your music is. And I don't think that's true at all. It may be better for the musicians, but I think for the listener, they don't care how many notes you wrote on the page. They just want to know how you made them feel. They want to have left feeling something. You can write 1,000 notes and make people feel something, but most people don't, to be honest. So that's one of those things I feel like we have to sort of unteach people, is that this music is really about togetherness, not the notes.
We end today with my talk with Seattle House Mafia, a DJ trio playing deep house, tech house, and progressive house music. DJs Sang Do, Phil Anthony, and Paul Velocity share their tales from the history and current state of Seattle's dance music world. Paul, can you just tell me, 30 seconds who you are, your background in Seattle? Are you from Seattle? How'd you get here, if not?
Yeah, sure. That's a lot to get through in 30 seconds. But yeah, briefly, the accent is from London, England. I moved to Seattle in 2015, and I've been involved with the house music scene my whole life as a DJ, as a producer. I've even put on events before as well. And through moving out here, I found that there's other people that share my passion, Sangdo and Phil, who are also joining me today.
Why Seattle for you?
This was a move for my full-time employment. What we do for me specifically is more of a side hustle. It's more of a elevated hobby, let's call it that. In order to pay the bills, I worked for a well-known travel company in London, and there was the opportunity to move to Seattle, and I took it. I didn't have anything holding me back. I needed to refresh my scene. I needed a different outlook on life, and it was an opportunity that just came at the right time.
Gotcha. Thank you. Sang-do, may I ask you to do the same?
Yes. Born in Seoul, raised in Honolulu, and then most of my life in Seattle, mostly West Seattle, and then started going to raves in 1993, which featured house music, breaks, and trance. And then in 1996, started DJing out at parties, raves, and sometimes at clubs, and still going strong.
Great. Thank you. And Phil?
Yeah, it's similar to Sangdo from the music side of things. I was born and raised in Seattle. I actually grew up in Kirkland on the east side, early 90s, very involved in both the grunge music scene from a spectator perspective and then the dance music scene at the same time. So in the early 90s, not only were there organized raves, but there was also a scene for break-ins. So old empty warehouses, backed up U-Haul truck with a sound system and a generator, and just turn it into a full night of dancing, lights, fog, music. Again, like Sangdo said, breaks, house, techno, drum and bass. It was really like no rules back then. And since then, have been involved with dance music in one way or another, and as a DJ since 97.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So I think with that context, then I might direct the first question at you, Phil, just given your longevity here in the scene. Could you tell me a little bit about how did house arrive in Seattle? And more broadly, how did house travel in the early days? How did something going on in Chicago and emanating from there, how did the underground work back then?
I think San Francisco and Chicago were large influencers as far as house specifically goes. So I think the West Coast house music scene started in the Bay Area, LA, Seattle. It spread from there and like a wave came across. And at the same time, house music specifically was super strong in Chicago as well. So you saw these convergence of both Chicago house music and West Coast house music early on. And Seattle was in where the waves crashed, right? But also you saw things happening in Vancouver, BC, north of us. So Seattle's been in this cool kind of weirdo corner of the world that we've seen dance music, house music sort of crash into us and expose us to all these different kind of areas. And then Sangdo will even tell you, coming from Honolulu, like there was a scene out there and there still is. So before the internet, by the way, it was mixtapes. And there were companies later in the 90s like Groove Tech. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but Groove Tech was actually an online record store, but they also had a 24-hour live streaming radio station, video and audio using the Real Player. So there were some ex-employees from Real Networks that were running that. So way ahead of their time. But that was also a significant area of exposure for just dance music in general.
What was happening here in the early 90s? You mentioned grunge, and some of even the anecdotes you told sound very similar, like people having warehouse parties or pop-up shows or just finding spaces at a time when there was much more space in this region to sort of guerrilla style an event. What were the formal venues and who were the supporters or the ecosystem? Was there radio support? Was there press? Were there record shops? Like, could you paint that picture a little bit?
Absolutely. So first, from the scene perspective, on the club side of things, I think my first real experience, and I may or may not have been of age at this time, we're just going to leave that there. But there were, so for instance, the Weathered Wall started a night called Lemon Twist. Lemon Twist was 3 floors of drum and bass, acid jazz, techno, house, and then gay, straight, queer, whatever you could imagine in the 90s was happening one night within this venue. And it was super eye-opening. At the same time, the grunge scene was going crazy as well, like 92, 93. And then there were a ton of record shops, Platinum Records. There was Zion's Gates. There was Segno, help me with a couple of the other,
My favorite, Exotic Imports.
The Exotic Imports, like there, and plus Groove Tech, again, was an online record store, but you could actually pick up the physical media. And then I remember even Cube 93, which you may be familiar with, they even had electronic dance music shows. So they were almost supporting the rave scene, whether directly or indirectly, with these dance music shows. And then there was another radio station a little bit later on, 107.7 The End, who also had dance music hours happening. So there was radio support. There was record stores. There was also clubs doing new and innovative things. Showbox Market had Electrolush, which was along the same lines as Lemon Twist at Weathered Wall. That was the other amazing night that was happening weekly on Saturdays. So there was a ton going on. You could literally go out every night and find something. And I almost had a calendar where I would go out Monday night to Victor's or Tuesday night to Victor's. And then Wednesday would be some other venue, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And then even Moe's, which you may be familiar with, or New Moe's now, they had a Sunday night, which was still probably my favorite night in existence, called Mo Funk, which was the sweatiest, dirtiest, down and dirty acid jazz night that you could imagine. And if you didn't go there, you could then go to Flammable, which still is the longest running house music night on the West Coast. And at the time, that was at Rebar. Now it's moved up to Chop Suey since the sale of Rebar. So there's a huge, long historical legacy of how this city has supported, whether directly or indirectly, dance music, the dance music culture, the dance music scene.
Was it an entirely local scene, or were national and international DJs coming through at that point?
I think you had national and international DJs starting to come through. And I think because there wasn't that easy exposure to SoundCloud or Mixcloud or the internet or YouTube, they would bring a flavor of whatever region they were coming from. So if you had a DJ coming from Baltimore, for instance, you could get like this really hardcore, gritty booty house, or you have somebody coming from the UK, again, a totally different sort of flavor. So they were coming in internationally, but there was also a very strong local scene.
All right. So Sancto, what's the scene you walked into as a younger man?
To finish the loop on radio stations, I also wanted to make an honorable mention to our friends and allies, CD 9.5, the holy mothership of global dance music radio that still exists today.
Absolutely. Good call.
And in the early 90s, they had things like nocturnal transmission. I still believe they do, but there were amazing DJs. My favorite mixes were folks from Canada, Markham and Czech, playing progressive and breaks, followed by advertisements of underground raves happening and a phone number. And then that's it. Because if you call the phone number, then there's more instructions. And that's what made it fun.
Yeah, you mentioned, I guess 95, 96 is when you started to wade into the scene. Is that right? Did I get that right in your introduction?
Yeah, back in 1993, as soon as I got a car, I started exploring the city and went to this legendary underground club called The Underground on University Ave. And that's where we all became friends with everybody. There were great local DJs here. Namely for me, I got inspired to mix well with Brian Pepper, DJ BPM. And then followed by folks like Michael Manahan, who is part of the Castadia events.
Yeah.
I think for the most part, our import DJs were national from the West Coast. The big folks were always Mark Farina and John Howard. As Phil mentioned, Electrolush was a Saturday night at Showbox Market, and it started getting bigger and more people started supporting it. That's when I started seeing folks like Paul Oakenfold and Paul Van Dyke that we can afford to pay and fly in and pay, mainly by other crews such as USC, who threw many great raves, Freak Night, parties up the gorge. Yeah, I think that's how all this happens.
click back just a half a step or so. When we talk about the calling the phone number and getting the location or getting the directions or getting the more information and sort of the underground rave scene here, call it early to mid 90s. Like, how big was the scene? Was it 200 people? Was it 1,500 people? Like, can you set a sense of like what was going on here? How big?
Yeah, they were all amazing. It doesn't matter how many patrons attended. For example, I remember going to the Lish House on Rainier, and it might have 50 people, but the people were great. They were high vibing, great energy. To events at the NAF studios where various rave production promotion companies would grow, that can go up to like 4,000 to 6,000 people. As Phil mentioned, it's almost every night.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you ever have a sense at that time, like, where did these people come from? Did you know that the scene was that big? Was it ever a surprise to be like, good God, there's thousands of us?
Yeah, I think people who are even more underground that started doing this during the wave era in the 80s that helped kind of pave this way. But for us who raved in the 90s, this explosion and this discovery all happened at the same time. So there'd be so many parties, whether small or large, we would attend and we would make new friends and discoveries of new genres all at the same time. And it was really magical because like-minded folks were discovering this high vibrational music all at the same time. It didn't really matter who was playing and what was playing. You just knew you can go somewhere and you can be anything. You could be all walks of life and you're pretty much accepted because we're all really dancing to the same frequency. And that is so special.
Sure.
I was just going to make one mention. So Sego mentioned it a couple of times, which is NAF Studios. And Lawrence, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Mark Naff and NAF Studios, but fun fact, I think Alice in Chains filmed Man in a Box in actually NAF Studios. I don't know how many great albums and songs were cut in NAF Studios from the grunge era. So again, we're talking about this kind of wild convergence of dance music and grunge music and the same building being used for wholly different purposes, but amazing output coming from NAF Studios back then. I just wanted to bring that up.
Did you guys find that people moved between those worlds?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely did.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think there was good money to be made at running sound at the Color Box at Pioneer Square. Probably paid one thing, but running sound at a 5,000 kid rave with 3 rooms, it's probably a whole nother payday. I don't know for sure, but that would be my guess.
Yeah, that'd be my guess too. So, Paul, all this is going on, and I'm so intrigued with the London element. My first trip outside of the States was in the mid 90s, and I went to London with a friend of mine. I was living in New York at the time. We had a friend who was an expat, so we had somebody to stay with. And one of our first nights there, he said, "I got to take you to this place, the Blue Note. There's this crazy shit going on there." And it was, one of the drum and bass nights. I didn't come really from a consciousness of that scene. My interest or my knowledge of electronic music was definitely much more of like an ambient, like Bill Laswell sort of inflected New York downtown and a Brian Eno type thing. And man, what a night. And whenever I talk to anybody who was in London at that time, I feel like I get that knowing nod and wink of, oh, it's so good you made it to one of those Blue Note nights. Like just a special time that people there remember fondly. While these guys were having these experiences here in Seattle, what was going on for you in London?
Yeah, pretty much a similar experience in terms of the underground connections, the texting the phone number, the calling the number, getting the directions at the secret parties out in the middle of nowhere. That was going on. I mean, music was it was subdividing. So I got into house music a little bit later. I'd say probably very late 90s, early 2000s. And there were at the time a lot of subgenres going on. For myself personally, I was into drum and bass, UK garage, as well as house music. Before that, I was into happy hardcore, 4-beat. It was just kind of like a natural progression for me. And even with drum and bass, there's so many different subgenres. You got liquids, drum and bass, you've got jump up drum and bass, all those, and that's just under one category. So having such a diverse range of subgenres within each of the different categorizations of music led to very diverse production in the UK. And the sound was spread using physical media. as Phil mentioned, there was a lack of internet, lack of SoundCloud. So in order to hear and listen to music, you had to actually physically be there. And so that's what these underground parties provided. It provided a way for producers to cut acetates or white labels and get their music out to a very small select audience. It allowed people that were in the scene to go and listen to this very cutting edge music that was happening. And we didn't realize this at the time, I don't think, but we were part of the movement. We were part of the industry by helping this music to evolve. And so the scene, it very similar. Like we have Ministry of Sound, we had Heaven, Coco, China White. We had like a number of large clubs in London, some more well-known than others, different sizes going on, but it was a different vibe. There weren't phones out, there weren't distractions. People were there for the actual music. If we look at what James Hype is doing today, he's calling on the events that he's attending to have a mobile phone ban in order to try and get people back to focusing on the music and to dance and to have a good time. And when I first started coming into house music and understanding what that scene looked like, we didn't have our phones out all the time. We were there for the music, listen to some amazing stuff. And even like the production quality of how music is back then versus now, like music production has advanced so much today. It was a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult back in the earlier days. And so there was more of a raw sound. And that's definitely what I gravitate towards. And I think that's why the underground scene that I was very fortunate to be a part of is part of my history that I'm very proud to have belonged to. And it's just that raw, unfiltered sound of people coming together for the love of music, for the passion. I believe it was Sangdo that was saying that, everyone really coming together as one, unified by the music. And that, something very special.
Phil, I wonder, as someone who's been sort of here for a long time and has been in the scene for a long time, do you have any thoughts or comments on like the health or the state of the electronic music scene here today? Is it vibrant? Is it alive? Is there a future, or is it like you're just keeping it going? Like, I'm very curious about that.
It's interesting. And again, this is coming from my own set of experiences, but I think we're all mature enough to know that good old days they're subjective, right? And as long as you're involved and offering something back, they were a moment in time, but they're not the only moment in time to hang on to. So the real sort of surface level answer is COVID was very rough on just dance music in general, just by virtue of not allowing people to get together in person. On the other hand, a lot of people started with Twitch, and guys like me who had dust collecting in my studio all of a sudden started doing music again, right? And I think the same story is true for thousands and thousands of folks with our experience, our age, kind of that group. So I feel like there's a resurgence now. We have some amazingly talented DJs in Seattle and the surrounding area. We have some amazingly talented producers. I feel like Seattle's always been an uber creative scene. There's a ton of talent on the production side, a ton of talent on the performance side. And then there's people taking shots at other things. For instance, I never had a vision to host an interview show myself, right? I thought it'd be really cool getting into the podcast thing because I spent a lot of time during COVID listening to podcasts, like trying to find other places to focus my energy. And here we are. We took our shot and we're starting to have some kind of momentum and success and teaming up with like-minded folks. That also happened by virtue of COVID and how COVID kind of forced isolation on us from those larger circles. From my observation, okay, we call our early mid-90s, early 2000s the golden era, but I think there's a massive resurgence and just a variety of things that are happening, more music exposure. Everything's not so focused with one crew or another crew. Like, people are trying new things. People are making content, whether in person or online. It's just a really exciting time in general. So there's a lot of cool things going on. And I'm also like the eternal optimist about where the scene's going. And the one thing I'll say that shifted for me, I'm much less competitive than I was as a young man when it comes to gigs, for instance. But I'm also much more open to the idea of supporting the community and creating something that platforms other people and helps expose other people to larger audiences. That's a huge thing for me. And I didn't realize how much that sort of fed my existence until we started formalizing things that we do with Seattle House Mafia. So yeah, to answer your question, awesome time to be in the area for dance music. And there's also awesome things that a lot of different people are doing to bolster that.
Thank you so much, Shain Shapiro, Thomas Marriot, and the members of Seattle House Mafia. As always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On, a production of 23 Media Ventures. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant. Our theme music is by Q Burn's Abstract Message. The most important member of our team is you. Thank you for supporting our work. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, ongoing postings on our official blog, our online store, and a link to make donations to support our work. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.